The biggest lie in a shock like this is always the same. People think the danger ends when the television says the worst is over. They think if missiles stop flying for a week, if a ceasefire is announced, if the oil price comes off its highest panic print, then the reset button has somehow been pressed and ordinary life can go back to normal. That is not how economic shocks work. If you eat something poisonous, you do not feel better the moment you stop eating it. The poison is already in the system. It still has to move through you. The symptoms often arrive after the event that caused them. That is exactly what I think is happening now. The Iran shock did not end because the headlines became slightly less dramatic. The financial consequences are only beginning to work their way through the economy, and by the time the average household fully feels them, the people who understood the mechanism early will already have adjusted, while everyone else will be standing there asking why everything suddenly became harder. That is why I want to be very plain about this. I am not interested in the military theater for its own sake. I am interested in what happens to your bills, your paycheck, your savings, your purchasing power, and the wider economic environment over the next 6 to 12 months. Because that is where real life is decided. A lot of people still think this story is just about oil. That is too narrow. Oil is the spark. The real problem is the chain reaction that follows. Energy touches almost everything. Food, freight, packaging, manufacturing, heating, logistics, travel, utilities, chemicals, construction. It is the invisible ingredient in a vast share of modern life. When energy gets hit violently, the shock does not stay where it started. It works outward, quietly at first, then all at once. And that is why I think a lot of people are sleepwalking into the next phase. The first impact is obvious once you stop pretending prices reset with headlines. Your monthly costs are likely to keep rising before they come down. That is not alarmism. That is how these transmission mechanisms usually behave. A price shock in energy hits the front end first. Then, companies begin repricing what they sell because their own inputs rose. The supermarket shelf reflects the transport bill. The transport bill reflects the diesel bill. The diesel bill reflects the crude price and the insurance cost of moving anything through a region now viewed as unstable. By the time you see the final number at the checkout, the chain reaction has already passed through half a dozen balance sheets. This is why I tell people not to make major financial commitments right now on the assumption that relief is around the corner. A new lease, a large finance purchase, a debt-heavy lifestyle decision. These things become far more dangerous when your baseline cost of living is still drifting higher and you are pretending the drift has ended because a politician said the word ceasefire. The trouble with inflationary shocks is that they do not ask whether you planned for them. They simply arrive and start repricing your life. That is the first thing. The second thing is worse because it touches income. Higher prices do not just make households weaker. They also squeeze businesses from both sides. Their energy costs rise. Their transport costs rise. Their input costs rise. At the same time, their customers start spending more cautiously because households are being squeezed too. That means companies face rising expenses and softer demand at the same time. It is like putting a business in a vice and tightening it from both directions. That is when labor markets deteriorate, not always in one dramatic employment apocalypse. Often it begins in a quieter, more ordinary way. Hiring slows. Open roles disappear. Overtime gets trimmed. Contractors are cut first, then weaker firms freeze, then stronger firms become selective. The worker at home still feels fine right up until the quarter when his industry decides it no longer needs as many people as it thought it did. This is why I never assume a job is secure, simply because it feels secure in the moment. Jobs are stable until the economics around them stop being stable, and the energy shock is landing on top of a labor market that was already less healthy than many headlines wanted to admit. So if you ask me what to do, my answer is practical rather than dramatic. Become harder to replace. Make yourself more useful, not more comfortable. Reduce the part of your life that depends on one paycheck arriving on schedule forever. That advice is always sound, but it becomes urgent in an environment like this. The third impact is that people are still overestimating how much help policymakers can provide without making another part of the problem worse. That is a very important change from the last crisis cycle. In the past, the public got used to the idea that whenever the economy got ugly enough, the authorities would pull the same levers: cut rates, flood liquidity, spend more, stabilize things somehow. Maybe not elegantly, maybe not fairly, but the safety net existed and the public learned to assume it would appear. The difficulty now is that the old tools conflict with the current conditions. If inflation is rising, cutting rates becomes dangerous. If debt is already massive, borrowing more to subsidize everything becomes more dangerous. If the government is already devoting an enormous amount of tax revenue just to service existing debt, then every additional intervention comes with more strain than it would have in a cleaner balance sheet era. That matters because the public is still psychologically living in the last rescue regime, while the math of the current one is much uglier. In a normal downturn, policymakers can often ease aggressively and say they are saving the economy. In a shock like this, easing too quickly can worsen inflation. Staying tight can worsen unemployment. Spending more can worsen debt stress. Doing nothing can worsen social anger. That is what makes this phase different. The safety net is still there in theory, but it has holes in it. That brings us to the fourth impact, which economists have a clean word for and ordinary people experience as a dirty one: stagflation. I dislike jargon when plain English will do, so let me put it simply. Stagflation means life gets more expensive while the economy gets weaker. Your bills rise while job security weakens. Your income becomes less reliable at the same time. Your essentials become less affordable. And the usual policy tools stop working cleanly because the medicine for one symptom worsens the other. Raise rates to control inflation, and you squeeze growth harder. Cut rates to protect growth, and you risk feeding inflation harder. That is why stagflation is such a nasty environment. It traps both policymakers and households. And once you understand that trap, you stop thinking in the lazy old categories. You stop imagining cash is automatically safe just because markets are volatile. Cash gets quietly eaten in inflation. You stop imagining speculative growth stocks are the answer just because you hate inflation. Weak growth punishes fragile valuations. You stop imagining that simply waiting it out is a strategy. In an environment like this, waiting without preparation is often just a slower form of surrender. The people who navigate stagflation best usually own things that can either hold value in real terms or produce cash flow attached to things people still need in a weak economy. That is why structure matters more than narratives. The fifth impact is the currency effect, and this is where a lot of people are still asleep. The dollar remains the global reserve currency, yes. But reserve status is not a magic shield that can be abused forever without consequence. If the United States is forced into a corner where every realistic policy response weakens the currency in some way, then the rest of the world begins adjusting too. Some of that adjustment is already visible. Foreign official appetite for treasuries has softened. Central banks have been increasing their gold holdings. Smart capital is always asking a quiet question before the public does. Do I want more paper claims on an overextended system or fewer? That question matters for ordinary people because they still think in domestic terms. They think a weaker dollar is just an abstract macro chart or maybe a travel inconvenience. It is much more than that. A weaker dollar reduces what your savings can command. It changes the cost of imported necessities. It changes the relative value of assets. It changes who wins from inflation and who gets bled by it. This is why I keep telling people not to think of their money only as a number in an account. Think of it as a claim on future goods and services. If that claim is being weakened while you sit politely in nominally safe holdings, then your caution may actually be another form of loss. The sixth impact is the most socially corrosive one of all. The shock will not hit everyone equally. That sentence matters because a great many people still speak about inflation as though it were an annoyance experienced by the whole country in roughly equal measure. That is nonsense. A higher income household can notice a more expensive grocery bill and continue living more or less as before. A lower income household can experience the same category of inflation as a direct attack. Food and energy are not just line items for poorer households. They are huge slices of the total budget. That means the same inflation rate can be mildly irritating for one family and life, altering for another. Then governments step in with subsidies, caps, or relief schemes, and the public thinks help has arrived. Sometimes some relief does arrive, but very often the design of these interventions leaks upward. The state absorbs part of the burden, large producers maintain pricing power, shareholders collect the gains, and the working or middle household is left with partial relief and a permanently weaker long-run position. That is one of the ugliest features of this kind of environment. It does not simply make people poorer. It widens the distance between people who own assets and people who only live on labor income and cash. This is why I say economic shocks are never only about prices. They are also about hierarchy. They reveal who has a buffer, who has an asset base, who has optionality, and who has none. Now, if you put all six of these things together, the picture becomes much clearer. Rising everyday costs, a labor market that can weaken quickly under pressure, a government with less room to rescue without creating other problems, a stagflation risk that traps households between weak growth and rising prices, a currency backdrop that makes passive savings less trustworthy, and a social distribution of pain that lands hardest on people least able to absorb it. That is the real shock. Not the missile strike itself, not the shipping lane headline itself. The real shock is how those events pass through the economic body and turn into a broader loss of purchasing power, stability, and confidence. That is why I think the phrase, "it is cooling off," is so misleading. Maybe the military theater is cooling off. Maybe the worst headlines are cooling off. But financially, the poison is still moving, and if you want to protect yourself, you have to start there. Not with fantasy, not with political wishful thinking, not with the comforting idea that they will fix it before it reaches you. You have to protect yourself by tightening the part of your life that can still be controlled. Do not make new fixed obligations lightly. Do not assume income is guaranteed. Do not let all your capital sit in forms that inflation can quietly injure. Do not remain unskilled in an economy that may soon reward resilience and punish passivity harder than before. And above all, do not wait for the average person to feel the crisis before you take it seriously. By then, serious people are usually no longer reacting. They are already positioned. That is the difference between getting hurt by the shock and surviving it. The average person responds when the pain becomes undeniable. The better move is to respond when the mechanism becomes visible, and I think that mechanism is visible. Now, the Iran shock did not just start a geopolitical event. It started an economic relay. The baton has already been handed from oil to transport, from transport to food, from food to household budgets, from household budgets to corporate margins, from corporate margins to employment risk, and from employment risk to broader social strain. That relay does not stop because one man gives a press conference and says things are stabilizing. It stops when the whole chain finishes repricing the economy. And I do not think we are close to that yet. That is why I would not waste this period pretending the danger passed. I would use it to make sure my finances can take a hit. My income is less fragile than before. My savings are not standing naked in front of inflation, and my household is not one bad quarter away from being forced into weak decisions. That is not fear. That is preparation. And in a period like this, preparation is the one thing that still gets cheaper before everyone finally understands why they needed it.